Greetings and welcome to all of you joining us today for our Collegeville Connections session with Father Columba Stewart. Collegeville Connections is an ongoing series of online events brought to you by the Collegeville Institute, located on the campus of St. John's University in Abbey in Collegeville, Minnesota. Collegeville Connections highlights the work of Collegeville Institute alums and friends from across a spectrum of Collegeville Institute programs. We hope these online gatherings will provide an opportunity for new guests, program alums, and friends to stay connected to each other and learn more about the Collegeville Institute. Most importantly, as we say each week, you will have the chance to hear from some remarkable people. I'm Don Ottenhoff, Director of the Collegeville Institute. And before I introduce Father Columba, I'm going to turn to Susan Sink, a staff member at the Collegeville Institute. Susan is running the tech side of things for us today and will tell us what we need to know about logistics. Susan.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us. We actually have a record number of attendees. So we want to let you know that this is also streaming on our Facebook page, the Collegeville Institute Facebook page, live. So if you should lose your connection or your connection is unstable, you can always go to our Facebook page and watch there. And we do have someone there who is monitoring the comments. So if you want to ask questions, you can do that on our Facebook page and we'll relay them back over here. We will take questions and answers, and we ask that you not use the chat, but that you use the Q&A feature on Zoom. So if you go to the bottom of your screen, you'll see Q&A, type in any question you have, any question at all. If it's a simple question that I can answer, I will do so, or you can ask a question for Columba for the end of the session. And just enjoy, and thank you for attending.
Thanks, Susan. So today we will hear from Father Columba Stewart, a member of the Order of St. Benedict, who will speak to us about Benedictine monasticism as a way of life, its origins and future. Father Columba is the Executive Director of the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library on the campus of St. John's. He holds an AB in History and Literature from Harvard, an MA in Religious Studies from Yale University, and a Doctor of Philosophy from the University of Oxford in England. He professed vows as a Benedictine monk at St. John's Abbey in 1982 and was ordained to the priesthood in 1990. He has published extensively in his research field of early Christian monasticism. Father Columba was named by the National Endowment for the Humanities as the 2019 Jefferson Lecturer in the Humanities, the highest honor the federal government confers for distinguished intellectual achievement in the humanities. And that, to state it in appropriately rarefied terms, is a really big deal. Other Jefferson lecturers include novelist Toni Morrison, filmmaker Martin Scorsese, and author John Updike. In his role as Executive Director of the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library, Father Columba has been featured on many national and international media outlets, including 60 Minutes, BBC World News, PBS's Religion and Ethics News Weekly, as well as in The Economist, Smithsonian Magazine, and the Wall Street Journal. So again, here to speak with us about Benedictine monasticism as a way of life, Father Columba Stewart.
Thank you very much, Don, and hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. One of the great advantages of this medium is that we can be speaking to a truly broad audience located everywhere you can imagine. So it's really a privilege to be with you today. My goal is to introduce the Rule of Benedict and make the case for why it has proven so successful as providing a spiritual path, as well as for providing a kind of blueprint or charter for creating sustainable community. And I think both of those things are very relevant for people today, no matter what their particular circumstances of life are. And so I think that will give us plenty to talk about in the Q&A. I think historically, that's a result of my education, training, and interests. So I need to begin historically and situate the Rule of Benedict in its broader context, and then specifically within the monastic tradition from which it came. Then after that, we'll talk a little bit about the Rule of Benedict as a spiritual path and the keynotes of that spiritual path. And then we'll talk about the Rule of Benedict as creating sustainable community and how it structures relationships within community, all with the intent of realizing fundamental Christian values within a practical lived context. And then I think we'll have plenty to talk about at the end. So let's talk about the background. The actual dates and circumstances of the Rule of Benedict are not precise. Traditionally, we say that he was born around the year 480, so late 5th century, central Italy, that he died around 540, and that therefore the rule was probably 430, 435, as it seems to be the work of a mature and experienced individual. The biographical details we have are from the dialogues of Pope St. Gregory the Great, book 2 of the dialogues. It's a beautiful document and evocation of Benedict as a kind of successor to great biblical saints. In terms of what we think of as history and biography, that's not what it's about. So it's difficult to press it too hard for specific details. But they do give us the sort of basic outline of his life, his own monastic development, and then his founding of the great monastery of Monte Cassino, which becomes the mother house of Benedictines over the centuries. Now, what's really important to know about the Rule of Benedict in its broader kind of social and historical context is that it arises at a time of chaos and war. And so it represents an effort by a group of monks to establish a kind of sustainable and safe place where they can live the monastic life with all of that stuff happening around them. So just to give you a sense of what this means, so if we think of the late 5th century, around the time that Benedict is born, so after, say, 476, the Roman Empire, as it was, collapsed. And you begin to have a series of kingdoms in Italy, which are controlled by what we used to call barbarians, and now we call Germanic tribes. In other words, the ancestors of a lot of the people who live around the Collegeville Institute. So Italy was controlled by these various tribes who were seeking to expand and obviously move into a very wealthy and cultured area. And in the process of that, many of these Germanic tribes people became very sophisticated, educated, and cultured. So Benedict is born at the time of the replacement of the Roman Empire by those Germanic tribes. Well, the real power in the empire, the Roman Empire, had shifted east to Byzantium, so the great city of Constantinople. And you can imagine that the people who were there, who considered themselves to be Romans, because they considered themselves the heirs of the historic and older Roman Empire, weren't happy about these kind of rough-edged upstarts coming into Italy and taking over this area, which had so much history for the empire, as well as for Christianity. And so they pushed back. So around the time that Benedict is thought to be writing the rule, in the 530s and around the time of his death, somewhere around 540, there's a large war between the Byzantine forces trying to regain Italy and reincorporate it into the empire, and then these Germanic tribes people who've established their own kingdoms, and they're resisting the invasion by the Byzantine people trying to come and take it back. So this is really a kind of very messy, chaotic time where you can't count on anything. And so the importance of creating a sustainable monastic community within that chaos becomes all the more important. This isn't a time of tranquil contemplation. This is a time when you had to create a place where contemplation could even be possible. So Benedict dies, the Byzantines win for a while, then the tribes people come back, Monte Cassino is destroyed. It would be destroyed twice in its early history and once again in World War II, which explains its motto, Succissa virescit, which is Latin for cut it back and it still grows, because Monte Cassino has done that. And the key, of course, to that is the rule itself, which allows a monastic community to start, to be refounded, and to propagate itself. Now, one last historical note before we go into the monastic background to the rule, and that is to say that really the reason that we're even having this conversation, that I'm a Benedictine monk of St. John's Abbey in Collegeville, Minnesota, is because of those Germanic tribespeople, because it was the greater stability brought in the late 700s, early 800s by the Frankish kingdom of Charlemagne and his successors. So this Holy Roman Empire, which sputtered on for many, many centuries after Charlemagne, that is when the Rule of Benedict really came to the fore as the standard monastic rule. And so we say it's really Benedict who wrote the rule, and then another Benedict, St. Benedict of Aniane, who was the agent of the Carolingian Empire, founded by Charlemagne, continued by his sons. Benedict of Aniane was the monastic agent who reformed the monasteries, and they did it on the basis of the Rule of Benedict, and that included many of the monasteries responsible for founding us. So when you hear a little bit of that history, I hope it makes the rule a little more interesting and makes it a little more relevant for thinking about times of social flux and change and conflict. When we talk about the rule itself and place it within a sort of broader monastic lineage, it came along at a really good time, because the Rule of Benedict was written as a kind of culmination of an early period of rich development of monastic literature. There were already other rules, and those rules were used by Benedict, as well as other monastic literature, because these are the days when plagiarizing from a predecessor was a mark of tradition and reverence. It wasn't something you had to footnote, although he gives us some clues here and there about what he actually used as his sources. So the Rule of Benedict is not the last rule, but it is the one that lasted, precisely because it comes along at just the right time to benefit from the earlier monastic wisdom from places like Egypt and Gaul, which is modern-day France, from Italy itself, from as far away as Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. All of these influences coming into the Western Latin monastic tradition through a large enterprise of translation. And so you had people who either went there or who got a hold of these Greek monastic writings and then translated them into Latin. And those find their way into the Western monastic tradition exemplified by St. Benedict. Two major influences were John Cassian, who was a 4th and 5th century monk, probably originally from Eastern Europe, spent time in Palestine and Egypt through various circumstances, which are interesting but not relevant today. He eventually lands up in southern Gaul, so along the kind of modern Côte d'Azur, southern France. And he becomes the sort of monastic consultant as they were beginning to establish monasteries in the early 400s in that part of Western Europe. And Cassian creates a kind of handbook of monasticism for dummies, or a sort of how-to manual. And this becomes very influential on all of later Western monasticism, as well as on other authors like Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits, and others who really appreciated the classic spiritual teaching of Cassian's writings. And then the other text that I want to mention is something called the Rule of the Master, which is a very long and idiosyncratic and often downright cranky and perverse monastic rule, which has some gems, even in the midst of some things that are just a little bit off. One of Benedict's geniuses was to be able to work with a source and take what was worth keeping and set aside the things that either were not relevant or just didn't seem to be based on sound wisdom and experience. And the result of that is his rule in its 73 chapters, which not only was made the official rule of the Holy Roman Carolingian Empire, but it also was already gaining ground and being adopted by more and more monasteries as far away as England, because it was so sound. It was practical and it was spiritual, and it really seemed to be based on genuine pastoral experience. And that's why we continue to use it today. So I want to talk a little bit now about the keynotes of the spiritual path outlined in the Rule of Benedict. And a way of thinking about this is, to use more modern terms, this is a kind of program of human development within an explicitly Christian framework. So this is spirituality with feet on the ground. This isn't something kind of entirely metaphysical and off somewhere in another realm of existence. This is very much rooted in experiences that human beings go through on their path toward maturity. And the rule is trying to kind of bring together those inevitable experiences of human life and development with Christian teaching, so that there becomes a kind of dialogue between Christian theology, the model of Christ, the role of the Holy Spirit, and so on, and things that people tend to go through as simply in the process of growing up and growing old. So I want to talk about three particular keynotes of the spirituality of the rule. The first is accountability. So accountability to God and to human beings. Accountability. And the traditional term for accountability is obedience. And obedience is a major theme in the Rule of Benedict. And as many of you already know, the word obedience has its roots in the Latin word meaning to listen. And so therefore, the first word of the Rule of Benedict is obsculta, which means listen, from that same root as this concept of obedience. Now, when we use the word obedience today, it's often presented as a kind of top-down thing. You are obedient to higher authority, you're given an order and you do it. We know that that's not always a constructive exercise. It's good to obey the stop sign, it's good to obey legitimate authority. That's the basis of a law-based society. But obedience can also be misused, as we've seen in certain contexts of war and dictatorships and so on. So that's why I like to use this term accountability to God and human beings, which is a way of saying that obedience enacts the fact that we are not independent agents, that we depend on others, God, human beings, and others, human beings, depend on us. And so we have to pay attention to each other. We have to listen to each other. We have to be willing to call each other on things which are not fostering the relationship or fostering accountability. And sometimes we have to be willing to kind of suck it up ourselves and do what we know what we need to do or what we've been told to do, even if left entirely to my own devices, it's not the way I might choose to live. Now, anybody who's ever had a job, anybody who's ever been married knows what this kind of accountability is. We call it obedience in a monastic context. And so when we talk about obedience to God, that's where the role of Lectio Divina or spiritual reading, which is a fundamental Benedictine practice, comes in. This idea that you look to the Bible, read slowly and contemplatively, not read literally, but read with an eye toward what in this is speaking to me, or how do I make this text written so long ago relevant for my life here and now? That's one of the ways that we hear the voice of God. And of course, we also hear the voice of God speaking through other people. And when I talk in a little bit about the structured community of the Rule of Benedict, I'll say a bit more about how that actually operates in his understanding of human interactions in community. The second keynote is learning from experience. And the term that the Rule of Benedict uses for this is humility. Now, humility is another one that we struggle with because we often hear the word humility used in phrases like false humility. Somebody who isn't humble at all, but pretends to be because they think it's the right thing to do or a kind of attractive virtue. The way that the Rule of Benedict uses humility is instead describing the process of learning from experience, and particularly the notion captured by the old Latin motto, ad astra per aspera. You get to the stars through hardships. You don't just sort of jump up and grab the thing that you want or reach your goal without effort. You have to go through a lot. You have to suffer. You have to give up things. You have to sacrifice. You have to sometimes be, frankly, humiliated. And then the end result of that, it's hoped, is you become a kind of fully realized human person. You know who you are and where you stand. You know your place in relationship to God. You know your place in relationship to other people. And you're okay with that you kind of stand on the ground of your own sense of self, which Benedict calls humility, which is the same root as the Latin word for earth, humus, not the hummus you eat, humus, earth, soil. If we stand there, and if we're able to lift up our eyes to God and look another person straight in the eye, we are fully inhabiting ourselves. And that is humility, according to the Rule of Benedict. Now, if you've read the rule, and probably most of the people watching this today have read at least some of it, you find the teaching on humility in chapter 7, which is kind of a compendium of teaching on obedience and interaction with others and processing the inevitable hardships of life. The chapter on humility has 12 steps, and any of you who are familiar with 12-step programs and AA and other such things will note the 12. And when you look at the 12 in the Rule of Benedict, it kind of offers a similar program of sort of realizing that there is a God, and that God is not you, and that sort of initial reality check, and then moving from there into what that actually means in the way that we interact with other people. And then learning to accept the fact that we can't always do what we want, and that sometimes we're imposed something that we would not have chosen ourselves. And then we have a choice. Do we, so we bucket all the time? Do we fight this instruction or this need or this obligation? Or do we maturely say, boy, I would not have wanted to do this. I really don't like having to obey this particular command or this need or respond to this challenge, but I can do it. And as you go through those stages, Benedict says, you begin to realize that it's impossible to judge other people because you become so deeply aware of your own weakness, your own sinfulness, your own dependence on God and other human beings. And so humility brings the corollary of fulfilling the most fundamental teaching of Jesus, which is do not judge. Because if we fully know ourselves, how can we possibly think that I'm better than another person? Because I know so deeply my own weakness and frailty, my own dependence on God and others, and I cannot possibly know another human being as well as I know my own self. So it's a lifelong program. The 12 steps of humility are not sort of checked off in the course of a year-long novitiate. And you can map the progression of those 12 steps onto really any form of life, because every form of human existence brings these moments of challenge through external circumstances, through things that happen in our own lives, through the inevitability of aging and illness, and so on. And then the third keynote of Benedict's spiritual path is growth in practical charity. And this is service, which is a fundamental aspect of the common life for him. That the monks were to serve each other. And they were to serve each other whether they felt like it or not. Because if you're going to put the food out, somebody's got to do it. And if you're going to get somebody to the doctor, somebody has to drive them. And if you don't change the toilet paper roll in the bathroom, well, imagine how the next person is going to feel about that. So this notion of service extends from the most highly exalted forms of service, right down to the practical things of washing the coffee cup you put in the sink, and so on. And service for Benedict is a way that we set aside a bit of ourselves and our own preferences to pay attention instead to the other. And that turn to the other, developing the reflex that the other person's need is more important than my own is one of the great fruits of the Benedictine life as outlined by the rule. And that'll be manifest when I talk more in just a moment about the structure of community. So all of this is fostered by explicitly spiritual practices. So I've mentioned Lectio Divina, the contemplative reading of scripture done each day. There's also what Benedict calls the work of God, or the divine office, or the liturgy of the hours. In other words, this periodic stopping during the day and night to come together as a group, to pray the Psalms, to listen to a biblical reading, to offer prayers of thanks and praise and repentance. And this is what really structures the Benedictine day. And I think the wisdom of the rule is he doesn't design this for spiritual athletes. He designs this for people who are really in spiritual recovery, who need structure, who need these moments where they have to set aside the tasks they're doing or the preoccupations they have to focus on what's most important, which is coming together as a group to hear the Psalms, the Word of God, and to pray both in silence and out loud. Now, all of this is lived within a structured and sustainable community. And the word that Benedict uses for this is stability. And this is one of the distinctive vows that Benedictine monks and nuns take. We don't take the usual vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, although those are kind of presumed. Instead, we take vows of a conversion of life, a conversatio morum, as he calls it, which has all that stuff in it. We also take a vow of obedience, which he understands in a particular way that I'll describe in just a moment. And then we take this vow of stability, and he calls it stability in community, which means that unlike other religious orders where people kind of move around from house to house, they get assigned to a different place for a while, and they're part of a sort of widespread congregation, Benedictines join a particular community. And the norm is that we spend our entire monastic life with that community. That doesn't mean we're necessarily geographically there all the time, but those are our people. Although, of course, most of the people do spend most of their time there, living in a particular place and inhabiting it. And Benedictines have a reputation for taking good care of where their monasteries are because they intend to be there for centuries. This isn't, oh yeah, we got a good price on this house. It'll work for our little priory for a few years, and then maybe we'll find something else we like better. No, we go and we settle. And so we've been in our particular piece of land since the early 1860s, a few years after our founding. And those of you who know Collegeville personally can see the care we take with our land, our buildings, and so on, because an aspect of stability is creating an environment which fosters all of the things I've talked about already. And so Benedictines have a keen aesthetic. We like beautiful nature. We like beautiful human creations, because these are all expressions of the talents and skills that God has given us. Okay, so now I'm going to turn to talking about creating community. The way that the spiritual path and the creating community overlap in the rule is in the most fundamental spiritual principle that Benedict teaches in his rule. And this is really, I would argue, the most distinctive marker of Benedictine spirituality. And that is the idea that Christ is present and Christ is met in the community in every aspect of its life and in every one of its people. Benedict speaks of the abbot as having the place of Christ in the community as teacher. The abbot himself, of course, is obedient to the gospel and Christ. So in our abbot, we are meant to see the presence of Christ. And that's why he has a place of honor, and that's why he's typically our teacher. But Benedict does not rely on a purely hierarchical, vertical axis of authority, where it's sort of God, abbot, everybody else. Instead, he says we meet Christ in all sorts of other people, including in people who might be the least expected. We meet Christ in the ill and in the seniors, that in their very suffering and weakness, they are representing to us and showing us the passion of Christ. We meet Christ in the pilgrim and the poor, the seeker and the wanderer, the person who has nowhere to lay his or her head, as Christ says of the Son of Man, of the poor who have thrown themselves on the mercy of God and the mercy of other people. We meet Christ in the young as well as the old. The point being, you realize Christ is everywhere in this life and in this community. If I can only learn to recognize his presence. And then, of course, sometimes the hardest bit of all is beginning to realize, hey, that means I'm Christ too in my interactions with other people. And sort of accepting the fact that I'm both a sinner, the program of chapter 7, and accepting that reality and God's mercy, and I am a bearer of Christ to other people. Wow. So when we think about the rule, that vertical axis I mentioned of Christ, the rule, and the abbot, and then the monks, that comes right out of the desert tradition. That's a kind of axis of obedience in the traditional sense. And I should say that the Rule of Benedict is unusual in saying that the abbot has to obey the rule, because the norm at that time is a new abbot could write a new rule. There wasn't a fixed standard to which everybody was accountable. And Benedict intended his rule, though it could be amended, to be something that everybody was accountable to, including the abbot. But there is also this horizontal dimension of relations in the community. And this aspect of the rule, which is talking about how monks relate to each other, including the abbot, but even like the youngest novice or candidate to the community, this horizontal dimension really comes from another monastic tradition, and that's from the communal monastic tradition of Egypt associated with St. Pachomius, and it also comes from St. Augustine, the towering theologian of the early Latin Church, who also himself founded monastic communities. And though Augustine could be pretty strict in lots of things, and not everybody likes some of his theology as a result of that, I myself don't like all of it, to be honest, his writings on charity are magnificent. And much of what he says about practical charity and sensitivity to the other and leading by love rather than strictness finds its way into the, and it's Benedict's absorption of that line of thinking, that strand of monastic teaching, that makes his rule so fruitful. It's not just this. It really is recognizing the dynamics of life together in community. So examples of this in the rule, for example, would be chapter 3, where he talks about the need for the abbot to consult the community when you have certain big items of business to do. So stuff that the abbot just can't do on his own. So it's, you need to, what can I think of that would have been relevant in Benedict's time? You want to build a new wing on the monastery, and it's going to cost some money. You want to negotiate with a local landowner for access to a field that you might be able to use even if you don't own it. I mean, these sorts of major things. And Benedict says that the abbot should call the monks together because the abbot himself can't count on the fact that the Holy Spirit told him what to do. And so you gather the monks together, and he says the reason you do this is that even the most junior member of the community, the newcomer, the one who's sort of last in rank in the monastery, may be the one to whom the Spirit has spoken. And so therefore you have to provide the opportunity where that manifestation of the will of the Holy Spirit can be heard. And that's why you bring the whole community together. It's not just a kind of gerontocracy of the old guys who've been around and know how the place works. You need to allow room for the Spirit to operate. I've spoken already of service. Benedict says the principle is the monks should serve one another. So that means in the refectory, the infirmary, whatever needs to be done, you're supposed to attune yourself to this reflex of attentiveness to the other person. And this takes me to one of the most, in my mind, I kind of geek out on this, one of the most interesting aspects of the rule and showing the genius of the rule is Benedict's discussion of rank in the community. And this is something which both kind of strikes us as a little bit odd, but also is where his real genius flowers. Benedict says that in the monastery, there should be a rank. People should kind of know where they stand in the line, literally stand in the line as we do when we have processions. They're in order. And where they stand for sort of other needs in the monastery where you figure out, who goes first or who gets first crack at something. But what he says is rank in the monastery does not depend on age. It does not depend on your family background or your education. It is purely objective based on when you entered the community. So the person from a poor background, uneducated, can rank higher than somebody who's an aristocrat if he happened to come to the monastery just 1 minute earlier. And he provides rank just so you can, as I say, make things sort of simple within the daily life. So giving people some sense of, as I said, where they line up. In traditional monasticism until fairly recently, where they would sit in the refectory in their order. But he also uses this as a way to talk about how you deal with conflict in the community. So that the basic principle is if I offend my senior, who may be younger than I am, but got to the monastery before I did, I should make the effort to apologize. And so I should sort of presume that I'm the one in the wrong because I'm the junior. I don't have as much experience and wisdom, and I should be willing to apologize. And so this sort of daily lubrication of interaction is what is meant to sort of govern things on a day-to-day basis. But remembering, of course, that rank in the community, who's junior or senior to me, depends on that objective criterion. Now, these days, we use the titles father and brother in a men's community, and that depends on whether you're ordained or not. In Benedict's time, you called all of your seniors nonus, which means venerable one, basically. And you called all of your juniors brother, which means that somebody could be nonus for you, but he's brother to somebody else. So this sort of relative ranking. Okay, so that's the practical thing. So far, it sort of makes sense in a kind of purely human way. But the genius of Benedict comes at the end of the rule, in the final chapters, chapter 68 and following, which are really his addition to the earlier monastic tradition of Cassian, the Rule of the Master, and so on. And this is where the influence of Augustine really shows. And this is where he begins to talk about what he calls mutual obedience, that we should pay attention to each other. And he talks a little bit about rank, but where he really goes in his great chapter 72 on the good zeal of monks is he breaks out of that practical day-to-day order. Gone are senior and junior, nonus and brother. Instead, he describes the fact that monks should be ever attentive to each other, no matter what their rank is, being alert to what the other may need, never pursuing what is good for oneself, but rather what is good for the other. In other words, through that life of spiritual service together in the community, you're meant to develop a kind of reflexive altruism. So it's not something you have to stop and think about and, well, how long is it going to take me? Do I have the energy? Do I like this person? Am I going to help him out? Instead, the whole point of the monastic life, grounded in those keynotes I mentioned earlier, is to make you immediately responsive. And this call to altruism, this call to recognize Christ in the other and to honor and serve him is the fundamental basis, not only of the Rule of Benedict, but the whole of the Christian life. Now, just one last note, this was a high ideal. And in the centuries of Benedictine life, it was not always realized. You had a highly hierarchical society based on sort of immovable social classes over the centuries. It's inevitable that this began to influence monasteries as well through the advent of clericalism. Some monks are ordained, some monks are not, through differences in education. And until Vatican II, monasteries of men and some monasteries of women as well were two-class societies with educated, literate monks chanting in Latin and being ordained and this kind of thing, women's communities, chanting the office in Latin, in the choir during much of the day. And then another class of monks who did the manual labor. And this was a reflection of the broader society. One of the fruits of the Second Vatican Council was to call all religious orders back to their roots and their tradition. And there is no such distinction to be found in the Rule of Benedict. Everyone works, everyone serves, you use the talents and skills to do the job that you're asked to do. And everybody is fully a member of the community. And so this was a real change for a lot of monasteries of men in this country, monasteries of women in Europe, which were more traditionally structured than the Benedictine sisters who came to the United States and by force of their circumstances could not live exactly the same life as Benedictine women in Europe with their more cloistered form of living. But it was a very important moment in bringing us one step closer again to the way that Benedict envisioned community. Christ in everybody and Christ in me as well. So I think instead of wandering off into more interesting byways of history, I think I'll stop there and invite comments, questions. I think, Don, you're going to field things and feed them to me. So away we go. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Columba. And I invite people to ask questions through the Q&A function of Zoom. Don't be shy. Writing it out might not be quite as easy as raising your hand. But the first question has to do with humility and the relationship between what you said was the rule is for people who are not religiously perfect, but they're in religious recovery. So given those 12 steps that you talked about with regard to humility, how much room for kind of imperfection is there in those 12 steps of humility?
Well, it's not like you get your certificate of completion for step one, and then you're done with that and you go on to step two. So, it's not learning judo or something. I think the whole point is that we're constantly cycling through them. And as probably everyone on this Zoom knows, human life involves a lot of repetition, of sort of going back through things. And I think the understanding of Benedict is like the understanding of his monastic predecessors, that we cover so much of the same ground, we make the same mistakes, but ideally, we're doing it not just in a level circle, but we're doing it in sort of a spiral. So as we do this, we're benefiting a bit from our previous experience. We know something is survivable. We know that we can recover from it. And that process of sort of repetition, going back up and down the steps, as well as I think many people find that just because of their personality or their issues, they spend a little more time on a particular step than somebody else might. And that's just because we're built differently. But I think the trajectory that he outlines is an important one, because it's saying that there is a point to all of this. And there is a kind of maturity, what he calls humility, that we can attain. And the proof of it is that we know people like that. So we know people, wisdom figures in our life, in our families, in our communities, in our workplaces, who seem to have got there somehow. And that doesn't mean they no longer struggle. It doesn't mean that they're no longer, tempted or whatever it is. It just means that they're kind of settled. And I think that's the goal that he outlines for us. And just one last thing on that, in the 12th degree of humility, I didn't go into them in detail. He talks about the truly humble monk as being the same wherever he goes. He's the same in church, as in the field, as on a journey, as at home. There's no pretense. There's no putting on a mask or acting out a role, depending on context. Always the same person. And I think that kind of freedom is remarkable and certainly worth striving for.
Another question. So the rule, I think, came out of what we tend to think of as the Christian West. Can the rule and the Benedictine way teach and be witness to the world, something other than the West?
I think it can, particularly when you realize that so much of the teaching in the Rule of Benedict is actually Eastern Christian. So it's coming out of Greek and Syriac and other traditions of the Christian East. And these traditions of the Christian East, which influenced the rule through translation, also traveled across Asia in the early centuries. I mean, there were Christian communities that come from this lineage in places like Southwest India in the 1st and 2nd centuries, and then the Great Silk Road across Asia. And of course, whenever the rule goes to a new place, it takes on some of the flavor of the soil. But I think the basic bones of the teaching work, even if some of the words in the Rule of Benedict need a bit of translation. And those of you who are being attentive today, which I expect is most of you, have noticed that I've done some of that translation myself. So I don't lead with obedience, humility, stability. I use terms that are more familiar to us in our kind of psychologically oriented way of thinking today. But I think that the teaching itself does work. And I think it's proven highly adaptable with Benedictines really around the world and almost every conceivable culture.
So some of the listeners are looking to you, Father Columba, as a wisdom figure yourself. And one question asks, how does the Benedictine call to respond to the needs of neighbors and those in community translate to the 24/7 news cycle and instantaneous communication? Many young people today are overwhelmed by the sheer volume of need in the world. How would you counsel someone who is reading the rule and looking at what's going on in various places around the globe, places to which you travel yourself?
Okay, so first comment, I'm an expert. I'm not a wisdom figure. There's a difference, okay? I think I was invited here because I have some subject knowledge, because obviously I struggle with all of this like everybody else does. That's human life. So the reason I opened my remarks today with that description of the context of the rule is to point out that the Rule of Benedict was created, it was forged and lived in a time of chaos and conflict. Now, granted, it may not have been the 24/7 news cycle that we're bombarded with because of electronic media, but it was nonetheless a time when people really had little confidence in many traditional structures and in the survivability of their way of life, whatever it was. So obviously the challenge for us is how we find a moment of quiet and peace in the midst of what is not only optionally, but even necessarily chaotic lives. Because if we have jobs working with real people, if we are engaged in activities which touch on the major and pressing issues of our times, we have to be tuned in. And I think this is one reason why something that Benedict presumes but doesn't say a lot about, which is contemplative prayer, has become so important in current times. I mean, the idea that you really would shut it all off and close your eyes and be silent for 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, a half hour, whatever it is. We've had to, in a sense, compress contemplation sometimes into those little hits, like getting a sort of hit of oxygen when you're climbing up a mountain. We need those intense periods of contemplative reflection and meditation precisely because of the chaos around us. And I think in Benedict's world, it was understood to be a little more spread out, a little more woven into the fabric of the day. So I think that's a way that we can cope. And I know that my little period of, I pray the Jesus prayer, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. My period of doing that in the morning, though it's not heroic in length, essential. And that's not only where I find a kind of bigger picture, that's also one of these curious phenomena of modern life where I realize what I actually feel. Because so much of our life is coping, processing, responding, reacting. Sometimes we're not always alert to what's going on right inside here. And maybe that's a particular affliction of the Western male, but it's certainly one I struggle with. And those contemplative moments, either of intense meditation or the daily walk that I try to do, it's one of my COVID practices, is taking a decent length walk every day. They can provide that opportunity.
Thank you. In a papal document, Pope Francis refers to, quote, the sacred duty of hospitality, unquote, as demanded by the rule of St. Benedict. Could you please speak to how hospitality is a blessing and a challenge to the community?
So I can speak about our community. It's really important to us, and I'd say it's 95% blessing. One of the decisions we made as a community about 20 years ago was to invest in building a proper guest house. And for all of our activities of hospitality, like schools, the Institute, and so on, we hadn't really focused much energy and resources on the fact that there are people who just want to come and hang out. They want to pray with us. They want to go for a walk in the woods. They want to experience a kind of quiet. They want to be in a room that doesn't have a television in it. And that was a key moment for us, because it helped us remember again what our entire Benedictine way of life is all about. Yeah, there's room for schools and the Lit Press and the Institute, all these other things that are on our campus, which are forms of hospitality. But the greeting the other and welcoming them in our guest house for a retreat or for just quiet time is a kind of purified form of hospitality. And that has been a great lesson to us. And it's also helped us understand better how all of these other things that we're involved in should, ideally do, manifest that Benedictine practice of hospitality. So it's built into us. It's part of Benedict's teaching. I mentioned earlier that one of the powerful ways in which we meet Christ is in the guest, the pilgrim, the poor. And so that's why it's pretty central in what we do. And I know that Pope Francis has called that out. Pope Paul VI, when he made St. Benedict the patron of Europe, emphasized that dimension of Benedictine tradition. It wasn't just the fact that Benedictines had elegant black habits and chant the office and this kind of thing. Our contribution really was this notion of hospitality founded on learning to see Christ in the other.
Another question is, do you see a role of the Benedictine Oblate for the perpetuation of the rule in the 21st century?
Absolutely. I think Benedictine monasteries, traditional Benedictine monasteries in this country and in Europe at least, are really in a moment of transition. And it's, to be honest, it's not clear how many are going to be around. And our presence in our apostolates, as we call things like our prep school, the university, and so on, is smaller than it used to be. So there are fewer of us kind of representing the monastic life and Benedictine principles in those environments. So we're learning more and more to regard our oblates not only as kind of, fairly serious spiritual people who like to be attached to a monastery, but really rather as something more like partners and helping us keep a lot of things going. So an active volunteer program, and many of the volunteers are oblates. We're helping out in various aspects of our life here. And then the way that oblates have grown from a pretty minor aspect of most Benedictine monasteries to being a pretty significant presence, large increase in numbers of people, all walks of life, all ages, different Christian traditions, so not all of them necessarily Roman Catholic, who are thinking very seriously about what this tradition means for their way of life. Married people, single people, whatever their circumstances are. And that's really exciting. And you match that to these various groups that go under the rubric of the new monasticism, of people forming intentional communities, which may consist of families who do certain things together but live separately, may have a little more intense communal structure, and are really looking to the Benedictine tradition for inspiration in how to do that. So I think we're seeing a kind of handing on of the tradition to these new expressions. And I think we'll always be around in the kind of traditional model, But I think the Benedictine landscape is going to be a lot more variegated and I think interesting and creative as we move ahead into an uncertain future.
There's a book out there now, which I think you're familiar with, the title of which is The Benedictine Option.
Yeah.
The main message of that book is that if we're to look at Benedict today, Christians need to separate themselves from a world and church that no longer forms souls but caters to selves. Is there a difference between forsaking the world and for the sake of the world?
So I've talked about this a little bit before, and I've had a polite disagreement with the author of that book on this matter. So without getting into a debate about what he says in the book, let me say this. I think Benedictines have always been enormously gifted at recognizing the times they are in and responding to them. And part of the call of Vatican II, of course, was for the church to engage with the world. So, the great document Gaudium et Spes, the joy and hope of the world, and it goes on to say, the sorrows and sufferings of the world, they are all the churches as well. And as I've thought a lot about this, one of the ways I'd like to express it is to say, the only world God gave us is the one we're living in right now. And the only moment in history that we have is the one that God has given us right now. And to withdraw from the challenges it poses, I don't think that's our vocation. Now, that doesn't mean that Benedictines don't need certain forms of separation for the sake of protecting their community, just like families need certain forms of boundary and separation to protect their own family life. But it means that we're fundamentally optimists about the human project. I'm fundamentally optimistic about what can happen when people follow the path that we've committed ourselves to. So I would prefer to do it on that kind of optimistic tone. And despite everything that happens around us, I just can't help but be optimistic about all this.
Great. Thank you, Columba. We're getting to the end of our time. We have a number of questions from people who are asking for bibliography. Which books would you recommend if people want to go deeper into the rule? Which of your books would you say people should start with? So I think what we can say is we will ask you that question here at the Collegeville Institute and put it up on our website. So those
Right.
of you who are asking for bibliography, we will ask Father Columba about that, and we'll put some information about that on the website. So thank you very much, Father Columba, for sharing your knowledge and your experience with us today. And thanks to all of you online for joining. And I'm really sorry we were not able to get to everyone's questions. We have a lot of excellent questions out there. So we may have to invite Father Columba to join us again, and you'll get another chance to speak with him. So we invite all of you to join us for future Collegeville Connection events. Please watch for event information and registration details on our website and social media platforms. Next Wednesday, March 17, same time, noon to 1 o'clock Central Time, you'll have the opportunity to hear from Susan Sink, who you saw earlier today, Collegeville Institute staff member, writer, and poet, who is the author of The Art of the St. John's Bible. The St. John's Bible is the first handwritten, hand-illuminated Bible in over 500 years. And next week, Susan will help us to come to know this stunning work more intimately, and I believe with images and explanations of the Bible itself. So once again, thank you very much, Father Columba. Thank you all for joining us, and have a wonderful afternoon.